This sponsorship ad is paid for by Yes on A, Safeguard Our San Diego Countryside, Committee Major Funding from Endangered Habitats League. Measure A, the SOS Initiative, encourages developers to follow San Diego County's long-term growth plans. Measure A aims to stop deals which allow sprawl developments to be built in high fire risk areas that lack proper infrastructure. A yes vote on Measure A gives a voice to the people. Trust people, not politicians. Voice of San Diego relies on sponsorships and member support. If you'd like to sponsor the Voice of San Diego podcast and share your message, contact Julianne Marco at julianne@vosd.org.
Thanks for joining us on the Voice of San Diego podcast in partnership with News Radio 600 Kogo. I'm Scott Lewis, CEO and Editor-in-Chief at Voice of San Diego. I'm joined, as always, by Assistant Editor Andrew Keatts. Hello, Andrew.
What's up, buddy?
Managing Editor Sara Libby.
Hello.
And this week, DJ Chica. What's up?
What's up? How are you?
Adriana Heldes is on the board. How are you? You have a little product you wanted to mention.
I do. It's called San Diego 101. It's my baby, basically.
Yeah,
that
you are.
I
It's
recently
Shepherd.
get birth. I recently get birth
So
to.
the successful birth.
Congrats on your birth. Enjoy your birth. Yeah,
Can't wait till next year when we celebrate your birthday.
Oh
You know,
my God.
Voice of San Diego has two missions, basically. One is to do investigative journalism, find things out people don't want us to find out. And the other is to explain things, to, serve as a kind of academy if you want to be involved here. How do things work? What is the port? What is the water authority? All these places. And you've done a series of 5 videos basically explaining things, huh?
Yeah. So it's 5 different videos on several things like local government, water, and there's one about Sandag, which features Andy, and I would encourage you to watch it just so you can watch his face.
Yeah, it's good. He's got a face.
Yeah.
Not to steal this episode's thunder, but I think we're going to be talking about water a little bit. So if that is confusing to you, the episode that they produced about how San Diego gets its water is super dope.
It's really good. You did a great job. Where can they find them?
VOSD.org/SC101.
Cool. All right, so DJ Chica might weigh in here and there. This week, we've got a great show. Councilwoman Barbara Bry maybe just killed one of the big plans for low-income housing advocates, or maybe did not. We'll talk more about that. We have an update on the long-running water battle, as Sara just mentioned. There are new people in charge of local water, and they have a rather stunning plan in the works. And a conflict over smart streetlights has made it to the streets. We'll have Jesse Marx come in and explain to us how police stumbled onto a mass surveillance opportunity. Don't always come by, but hello, mass surveillance opportunity.
They're going to take it when it does.
All right, but first, for 2 years, the San Diego Housing Federation and others have pushed a plan to raise property taxes to fund construction of affordable housing. They want voters to approve it in November. I mean, they've methodically guided this through the process.
Yeah.
But they just got some bad news. Councilwoman Barbara Bry said at a mayoral debate that she no longer can be counted on to vote for the measure. They can't have that. They need 6 votes to get the measure even on the ballot, and Bry is the 6th vote. So, well, here's what happened. So here she was in October at our PolitiFest debate about this measure.
We can reduce chronic homelessness by half. We can cut veterans' homelessness down to 0. And that's why the most important thing to me going into the 2020 election in terms of a ballot measure is the Housing Federation ballot measure that will be a small increase in property taxes and will allow us to build the 3,500 to 5,000 permanent supportive and low-income housing units that we need to build in San Diego. And I will be supporting that measure.
Okay, so
Unequivocal, right?
seems pretty clear.
Very clear.
Straightforward.
Also, it wasn't even in response to a question about the measure.
No,
she brought it up proactively to talk about how much she supported it.
The most important thing to her. Yeah. All right. So this weekend, I moderated a debate at Temple Emmanuel in Del Cerro. I asked the candidates about it again and turned to her and figured I would get the same thing. And she pivoted right when I asked her to a big pitch for Measure C, which was a little bit odd because she'd been one of those constantly standing in the way of putting it on the ballot in the mayor's preferred way. Remember that? Mm-hmm. But she gave a hearty endorsement for Measure C. It raised hotel room taxes and it used some of that money for homeless services. And she said for housing, although we haven't known for a while like exactly how much would be available for actual housing or permanent supportive housing. Anyway, then she said this.
I voted to move the housing bond measure forward because we kind of have to start moving it forward because we may not we have to get the legal analysis done in time. If Measure C passes, I will not support the housing bond measure because we will have funding from Measure C. If Measure C fails, then I will read very carefully the housing bond measure to decide whether to vote for or against it.
So she went from it's the most important thing, I will be supporting it, to I won't if the C passes, and I may not if it doesn't.
Right.
And so what that has implications for the race. But really, I think the most direct implications are, will it even make it on the ballot now?
That's certainly the first order of business, right? You can't even have a discussion about how it's going to fare at the ballot if it doesn't get there, and one has to come before the other. So suddenly that puts the proponents of this measure in a position where they have to either start lobbying her or hope against hope that Measure C fails, oddly enough, right?
I guess, do you think there's any possibility? I mean, she said in her explanation, I voted to move the housing bond measure forward, to keep it alive and get this analysis done. Do you think there's a world in which she can kind of maybe have it both ways and say, I'm going to vote to put it on the ballot so voters can decide, but I don't support it?
Yeah, I do. I think so. It would certainly be consistent with this level of parsing that we have right here.
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with a recent example of somebody on the city council doing that, although as far as it would be like perfectly logically consistent, I guess.
I don't know. It seems like a very Faulknerian type of thing.
Definitely.
Right? I'll let people vote on it. I'm not sure where I stand on it. Or I don't want to prejudice it or something. So just to be clear, this is a 19 cents per $1,000 of assessed property value tax increase. So if you own a $500,000 home, or a home assessed at $500,000, let me be clear, it might be a $900,000 valued home, but it could be assessed at $500,000. Then you would see a $95 annual property tax increase. That money would then be bunched together, borrowed against, and then the money that they got from Wall Street would then be matched with other money from the state and the federal government to build affordable housing.
Yeah, and so this is a tax increase. This would require a 66% voter approval. I think there had been some optimism around the plan because polling so clearly indicates right now that housing is like the voters' top concern about life in California and San Diego. But the rule of thumb that we always go by, that you really can't have any meaningful opposition to a tax increase, would be in play here. And it kind of makes things tough that Councilman Scott Sherman, who's running, has also been clear that he will not propose this.
Not support
this, excuse me. And so it seems that we are inevitably in the case that one of the two mayoral candidates on the ballot in November, and I suppose potentially both if Todd Gloria were to not make it through, will not be supporting a measure that they will share the ballot with.
And it's also, if you just set aside her seeming flip on the issue, the position itself is a pretty interesting one, given that she voted for this plan to address homelessness, which spells out a need for a dramatic increase in housing and housing aid. And, it's about $1.9 billion that everything in the plan has said it will cost. And she's saying, now that the Measure C money will be sufficient to address that, when we don't really know what it is or how much it is or what it's going to do.
Yeah, and I remember I pivoted after that to ask her, okay, so you're saying that the money in Measure C that is set aside for homeless services and that is notoriously not sort of earmarked, right? It's not dedicated to any particular effort. You're saying that A, can be used for housing, and B, will be used adequately for housing to handle what you said, because she has said she supports that plan,
Right.
which includes 3,000 permanent supportive housing units. And so this seems like the only plan on the table to fund any part of that.
Yeah, and I would take a step back also and say that typically when you hear opposition to the sort of supply side solution to the housing crisis, which is things like upzoning property to allow for more development, whether that's through something like SB 50 at the state level that we've talked about a lot, or more particular local measures. When you hear people who oppose that, often what they say is that is market rate housing, market rate. A flood of supply of market rate housing will never trickle down to broad affordability, and therefore what we should do is increase the amount of subsidized housing that we provide. Councilwoman Bry has spent a great deal of the campaign opposing supply-side solutions, and so it is a little bit atypical to hear her also now oppose a direct increase in subsidy for low-income housing.
Yeah. Well,
I have a
yes,
question.
Please.
So
DJ,
in the
Chica.
course of this race, how many times has Barbara Bry flipped on something how many times has she flipped on an issue?
Well, I think she did change her position from, I don't think she was necessarily running when she changed her position on this housing first model, right?
No, there was there was a committee meeting that was after she had declared her candidacy.
Right. Where she had said like housing first is the way.
Yes.
And then as we documented, that changed.
Right.
So I think those are the two big ones, I think, that stand out.
And they're obviously closely related. This is about building that housing that allows for housing first. So in some ways, I suppose they go together.
Right. Well, so if they want to get that on ballot, okay, remember, this is for November, this tax increase for the property tax. That's November, not the ballot that's going to be out in a month. And so that is the tax increase that's on that is Measure C. That's the hotel room tax. They are battling that out. I got mailers pro it, and I got mailers against it. A lot going on with that campaign. Again, that test is in effect. Can you have a tax increase that needs 2/3 vote? Can it pass with organized, funded opposition? Because Michael McConnell, the homeless advocate who came on PolitiFest and debated that and said he would spend money against this, he has now spent money against it. And we'll see if it's enough to kill it. So fascinating. Stay tuned for how that does that. Right?
Exactly.
One of the things I do is speak well. We still miss Ry Rivard, as you heard in Sara's voice, the nostalgia for our man. He did do that San Diego 101 on where we get our water, and it was great. We wanted to do an update on a particular situation he had been following. So we got John Lamb, who formerly of City Beat, to come and moonlight for a story about this ongoing legal battle between the San Diego County Water Authority and the Metropolitan Water District. It has so far cost ratepayers tens of millions of dollars. And basically the story was they're going to keep fighting.
Yeah, more or less.
And so let me just explain quickly. The San Diego made a deal when I first moved to San Diego about 15 years ago to get water rights from the Imperial County. They basically said, we're going to send you money and you need to give us some of the water that you were granted, that you own as a right. And but we don't actually have a pipeline from the Imperial County to here, so we have to pay this other agency, the Metropolitan Water District in LA, to ship us this, to transport that water. And so the legal fight they've been having almost since that deal was made is how much Metropolitan Water District, this giant agency based in LA, if you take the train up, it's right outside the Union Station there, big, nice tower. And that giant agency and how much they charge us is what this big fight is about. And it's been going on literally since that deal was made, like 10, 15 years. And so they've been trying to settle it. The mayor showed up, said, you got to settle it. They said basically no. But what really stood out for me in John Lamb's piece was the chairman of the San Diego County Water Authority. People who follow local politics know him well, Jim Madaffer. We used to have some run-ins here at Voice of San Diego's early days with Mr. Madaffer, but he rejected, along with the city's representatives on the Water Authority, rejected this settlement. And then he said this to John Lamb. He said, the Water Authority is forging a path to self-sufficiency, and there may be a time in the not-so-distant future that San Diego does not need MWD for most of its water deliveries. Okay, not only do we get this water that we've bought from them, we get water from Northern California from them, and just basic water from the Colorado River from them. So this was an interesting statement.
Yeah, it's interesting because, as Rye has reported for years, San Diego has been going through this process of trying to drought-proof its supply by doing things like building the desalination plant, building the recycled water plant. And all of those efforts mean that, maybe we'll have water if there's a drought, but also that we pay really, really high rates for water. And so that was the first thing that got my attention about this statement is he's envisioning this potentially massive project on top of these other really expensive projects. Like, how much are we going to be paying for water if this were to ever happen?
Yeah, inherent in that statement is that we may build a tunnel/canal from Imperial County and the Colorado River connection that we have to here. And that could be. Remember the Sunrise Power Link? Were you guys here for that? That was a brutal fight. And that was.
I came at the very end, still where there were enough like signs. If you drove out, once you got to say like east of La Mesa, you'd start to see signs opposing it.
Well, I got a little bit of an explanation as well about why they don't want to settle it. So Metropolitan basically offered him a bunch of money and said, let's settle this lawsuit. And we'll lock in this rate. That's what he's saying. He rejects. We'll lock in this water rate all the way into the future. And what Madaffer is saying is, I don't want to do that because they didn't protect us from costs that they might take on by building another tunnel in Northern California.
Oh, right.
That
they might take on.
Yeah. So Metropolitan Water District and the state of California have been talking for years about a tunnel that would divert water from the Sacramento Delta.
Twin tunnels.
Well, they've settled on one now.
Okay, yeah.
It used to be two tunnels, and that would bring water more efficiently from Northern California and would protect the Delta a little better.
So the logic being, if we can't be assured that we're not going to start paying for new costs for transporting water anyway, we might as well make that payment directed towards at least getting us towards self-sufficiency.
Exactly.
I mean, you can see a certain logic towards the long term, particularly on, say, a 100, 200-year time frame, towards not having to rely on anyone else. And particularly if you're like a doomsday prepper, not wanting to be at the end of the line, which San Diego very much is, and what that might mean in a time of scarcity. But in the short term, San Diego already has some of the most expensive water in the country. And that would only get worse in this scenario.
Well, I think they argue like maybe you could get a company to build that tunnel, and then you only have to pay them if they actually succeed, and if they can really make a better deal than what it's already going to cost us to do the Metropolitan Water. So that's how these things always get formed, and you never know 25 years from now that paid out.
There does seem to be no end to the logic of increased capital building.
Right.
In the name of self-sufficiency with water. That was the primary argument around the desalination plant, which was very expensive and provides us with very expensive water. That is the primary argument for the Pure Water project, which would be not very expensive water, but the project itself is quite expensive.
Yeah, that's the plan to take, what is it, 2/3 of San Diego's wastewater and turn it into potable water that we can then reuse, and that'll be a major part of our actual water portfolio in the future.
Can I just say that potable water sounds grosser than sewage water, as a word?
Yes.
If I had to choose between which one to drink based on which word is grosser, I would drink the sewage water.
Yes.
All right, we're going to take a quick break. On the other side, we're going to talk to Jesse Marx about smart streetlights. You get 2 weeks in a row of the Marx.
Marksman.
I think his name's
That's what
actually
we should call him.
Messy Jarks.
It's a good one. Also, just as good.
You've just replaced the letters. I see that. Yeah, that's good.
Right. But in this case, it works well. And messy is a word that has a meaning outside of Jesse.
All right, Messy Sharks will be in to talk about smart streetlights and how the battle over them hit the streets this week. We'll be right back.
I'm Adriana Heldies, and I'm a producer at Voice of San Diego. When I started working here at Voice, and whenever we hire a new reporter, we get a debrief of the entire region. It's a quick but useful explanation of some stuff most people in San Diego don't know about. Our CEO, Scott Lewis, walks us through things we need to know in order to follow all the in-depth reporting Voice of San Diego does, like how San Diego gets its water, how local government works, why there are different types of schools, and who decides major things that affects us as San Diegans. These things help us understand the bigger picture and the drama that's happening in San Diego every day. And then we realized that everyone else should know this stuff too. So we started a project called San Diego 101. It's a video series that explains it all. Our videos will help you understand how our region works, and you can watch all 5 episodes now at VOSD.org/SD101. Again, that's VOSD.org/SD101.
We are back. City Attorney Mara Elliott held a press conference this week touting the game-changing crime-solving capabilities of the city's smart streetlights. 200 crimes resolved, murders, rapes. It got a bit tense, though.
This is vindictive, this is retaliatory, and you should be ashamed of yourself, Mara Elliott.
So, great for crime fighting, but when the program was rolled out and city staff presented it, they sold it as a way to protect the environment, use energy more efficiently, and mitigate traffic. Jesse Marx is here. He's going to help us explain what happened. How did we get from these smart streetlights to this kind of street argument about these cameras?
Well, we put into place technology that was extremely useful to law enforcement. Nobody bothered to ask that question up front, or I guess apparently consider it.
All right, take me back. When did this program start? What is a smart streetlight?
So the program got rolling several years ago, actually, and in late 2016, the city put together a proposal to retrofit its streetlights with sensors that were both visual and audio capable. And they partnered on this with General Electric. So GE offered to loan the city $30 million to get this thing rolling, and like I said, to retrofit older streetlights with these cameras and these other sensors. And the idea was that the city would gather up data based on pedestrian traffic, vehicle traffic. It would also monitor the atmosphere. And so you'd have a combination of things going on. You would have this data that would be useful not only to the city for planning purposes, but they could also put it out there to the public for app developers and people to do whatever they want with it.
And how many did they end up doing?
A few thousand. They're still rolling it out at the moment. The last figure I heard was 4,000, but I'm not 100% sure whether all those have actually been installed yet.
And if you want to look for it to see if you know, it looks like a oversized spider basically on the edge of the light. It's got little pointers.
Well, and you can see where all of these are located. Actually, if you go to the city's website, there's a map, so you can just figure out where every single one is.
Okay, so were we the first city to do this?
We were the largest rollout of these devices, and so GE at the time was touting the fact that this was the biggest Internet of Things rollout that they had ever been a part of, and promoting it and marketing it that way, and the city did as well. And what happened was it would have been springtime of 2018, these things start going online, and by summer, the police department realizes, well, these are extremely useful to us.
All right, let's keep with the story where we're at. So what was the discussion at the city council for rolling this out? Did what was the main theme, and did the police come into it?
So no, the police did not come into it. The main theme at the time was this will save us money in our electrical costs because we'll be able to dim the lights from afar and we'll know where and when to do that. We're going to save a bunch of money over the long term. Within the materials that...
I'm sorry, just stop for a sec. We can dim the lights from afar. The idea being like if it's light out, we don't have to have them on?
Yeah, exactly. So they can better monitor and control the use of electricity throughout the city.
Instead of having like a light switch that goes like, should the lights be on or off, you could have fine-tuned controls about where lights should be on or on and or and how much.
Exactly.
Okay.
Is that what they meant when they were talking about the environment, like benefit of it?
Yeah, but what they were also referring to were like the atmosphere. So they were going to collect data on pollution, right, and on air quality. And so the sensors could measure those types of things, and then the city would be able to analyze where specifically within the limits of San Diego the air quality was poor. And then they were also going to release that data to app developers to potentially make, do whatever they want with it, so to study the city in whatever way they wanted. So,
and then there was also like traffic mitigation elements of it, right? Wasn't that part of the environmental?
That was part of it.
Like cars idling and things like that.
That was part of it too. And then a big component of it was parking. So they wanted app developers to figure out in real time where parking was available and not available so people could.
So ostensibly, these smart streetlights would help people then, or would help the city look at where traffic is getting congested, try to make changes to address that, look at the pollution, see if there was some solutions to lowering that, and then turn lights off when it was not needed. When did we start to understand, though, that police might want to look at the footage that was being captured?
So that comes into play in 2018. Around August of 2018, the police department is investigating a homicide near 5th and Market, and they realize, oh my God, there's a camera right here actually that we could potentially use. So the police department goes to the city and says, we would like to access these things. Can we do it? And the city says, sure. And the police department, to its credit, wrote the rules on how to access these devices and tried to put some limitations on themselves.
So yeah, there was not a policy sitting there where when the police asked for that footage, it was not as though whoever is in charge of that footage could say, well, let me consult this policy document that we have responsibly vetted and put in place to determine the civil liberties associated with anybody who was walking on the street at that point. They kind of just said, oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, we have the footage. Here you go. And the police took it upon themselves to say there should be some sort of rules around this sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly. So the police department comes forward and says, okay, well, if we're going to access these things because there are no policies in place, let's just write it and offer something up to the city. So they did, and that's how it has operated ever since.
Yeah, but I mean, certainly it's a little backwards given that they're the agency that's trying to access it. So presumably they're going to write rules that allow them to continue to do that.
Well, and yeah we'd love your input, but maybe you could be like somebody else in charge of this oversight. Now, so when we started following this, or you got into it and did a story this fall about what had happened, and you found 2 city councilmen who didn't even realize that the police could get access to this.
Yeah, so I went to Scott Sherman and Chris Keatts because both of them had been involved very early in the discussions of this program and because they were still on the city council. And so I asked them, I said, were you aware that the police department was accessing these devices for investigative purposes? And they said no. They said we had no idea. We're not opposed to that, but we would have liked to have known that because our understanding of this entire program was that it would benefit the environment and help us with our planning purposes.
So to be clear, we don't have any evidence that the city bait and switched on purpose necessarily. That might be in effect what happened as far as like they put out this streetlight program, but there's no evidence that that's what they were intentionally trying to roll out as a big surveillance program.
Well, it was a possible use of the technology. I don't think it was the primary use of the technology, but if you go back and you look at the materials that were given to city council members in late 2016, buried in the fine print in the back, it describes possible data services and possible uses of the devices, and it actually mentions the word surveillance. And it also mentions, I think it's gun detection in reference to the Spot Shotter program, which essentially detects where firearms are going off. It's an audio program. So that was there and that was known, and nobody really picked up on it or asked about it.
And it wasn't like a feature the way that atmospheric monitoring or traffic mitigation or turning the lights off was discussed.
Exactly. I've gone back and I've listened to at least all the public discussions on this program, and nobody ever brought that up. Whether it came up behind closed doors is another question, but council members Chris Cade and Scott Sherman told me it didn't, and they never heard anyone talk about it, whether or not it was in the fine print.
And so then this week, City Attorney Maura Elliott referenced those comments from Scott Sherman and Chris Cade.
Let's talk about what was she doing. So this has become an issue in the city attorney's race. Maura Elliott's the current city attorney. Corey Briggs is running against her, has made this an issue. They've brought up questions like she had a small amount of stock in the company, GE. There's all kinds of these kinds of campaign things flying. And she decides to proactively hold a press conference. Where did she do it and why?
So she did it off of Imperial Avenue. I think it was at 17th. It was right outside of the bridge shelter over there for the homeless in Sherman Heights. And she decided that was the appropriate location to tout the streetlights as a game changer for law enforcement, because a security guard had recently been murdered there, and the cameras had been used to arrest 2 men and charge them in connection with that murder.
Have we seen any results of the Smart Streetlight program championed other than this?
Primarily, they've championed the homicides, but there have also been car collisions, robberies. We have seen other examples of that in the press.
No, but I mean, no like breakthroughs on atmospheric.
Yeah, they're not
monitoring.
saying we developed an app to mitigate parking problems based on this. It's presumably the only benefits they've touted so far are related to this thing that they never sold as a use for it to begin with.
It's totally fair. Yes, I've never heard them talk about anything else.
Okay, so sorry.
And that's what the whole fight with the city council boils down to is Maura Elliott, called council members out saying, it was your job to ask questions and you didn't. But it's kind of a chicken and egg question, because how were they supposed to ask questions about something that they didn't know was a use of the technology? And
I guess what she's saying is if you read all that print, you could have said, hey, this says surveillance, let's talk about that.
Sure. It's just that now that it's being touted as the primary use of it, it would have been useful to have a public vetting of the benefits and risks of that technology.
I'm totally split on hearing City Attorney Elliott say this, because look, I have, in investigating things that have gone on in this region, I routinely come across issues where major information is being conveyed to the board of Sandag or the board of MTS or the city council, and there is totally inadequate questioning taking place. The most significant of which, in my opinion, was when the Sandag staff fessed up at the end of 2016, right around the same time, after we had been covering what became the Transnet scandal after that election. They came forward and said, we've got a big budget deficit, and the number of questions that were asked by board members was 0.0. Not one person said one thing in response to this information. So I'm with her. I get it. This is your job. Exercise oversight. I can't hold your hands through this. But it is an odd thing to hear it coming from the person who could have elevated those concerns on their own.
And is now publicly touting the use that was never discussed to begin with.
It's like, sure, it would be great had they done that. But the nature of transparency is not like, well, if you don't call us on it, then that's all in the game.
Yes.
Right? It's like she's saying, like, too bad, so sad, you had your opportunity. And I don't get that.
Well, and the moral is
from an elected official. Like,
we might if they were to roll out a surveillance system for the entire city, we would want a very inclusive, robust, rather long and involved discussion about what the rules should be, what the signage should be. You're on camera. They do that in Walmart. Like it seems like a public space. all these kinds of things. I remember they rolled out several cameras for the beach area in Ocean Beach.
Yeah.
And it was a thing for like 3 months, major hearings and discussion. The community ended up coming along because the beach area was filled with some issues that needed to be dealt with. And, and they wanted to make sure there were proper oversight and rules.
Yes, that's exactly it. It could have been that if this was all vetted publicly and we knew up front this was going to be used to help solve crimes, we could still have eventually gotten to a place where we say, well, it's worth the trade-off of all these various risks that we've now discussed. And we could have said, yes, we still want it because in the end, it's going to be used to solve crimes. And we like solving crimes. But we didn't have that discussion.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's talk about a discussion that we did have, or some people had. So she has this event at this shelter, this bridge shelter, a really bizarre crime, by the way, and kind of disturbing crime occurs. And she's there talking about the value of these things. And a weird thing breaks out. You were there. What happened?
So immediately after Elliot walks away, she starts doing some interviews with the TV reporters on the side. A group of activists step up, literally right where she was standing a few moments ago, right next to the memorial of the security guard who was shot, and they just start talking to the cameras that are there and just explaining to them their problem with this program and all the things that they felt like Elliot hasn't done or explained, and why the city council needs to get its act together now and write a bigger policy
And
around
she
this.
was there.
She was 5 feet away.
And she was lobbing accusations back at them, right? Or at least volleying in a debate, weirdly way.
I guess you could call it a debate. She more than anything, I think she was responding to what she felt like were personal attacks, because they did mention the fact that she owns stock in GE. And so she immediately jumped in and just said, that's a personal attack. I resent that. And she also said, look, that's not a conflict of interest. I would need to own 3% of the company for that to be an interest. And so they got into that kind of back and forth. But then there was also a lot of name calling.
And then the guy who manages that shelter, that tent shelter, he got involved too.
Yeah, so he stepped up and he tried to cool everybody down, and he said, look, everyone, we're standing at the site where a man just died. I think this is an important public policy debate that you're all engaged in right now, but please have it somewhere else. And
This is Bob McElroy. He's the head of the Alpha Project.
And the response from the activists was, well, we didn't call a press conference on this site. You or the city attorney did, and you're here now. So actually, I think the appropriate thing to do would be to not have this conversation here ever.
Okay, there's a coda now. Wednesday, there was a committee hearing.
So one day after Elliot called the press conference, it's clear to me that she called that press conference because she wanted to get ahead of the Public Safety and Livable Neighborhoods committee hearing on Wednesday. And she must have known that the committee members were going to be very hard on law enforcement. They had already talked about a moratorium on this technology, and they had been themselves pushing for some stronger oversight. So she was clearly trying to get ahead of it by going directly to the press the day before. At that committee meeting, the council members considered a policy just specifically for the data use around the streetlights, and they actually rejected that. And instead, they told city staff to come back with a larger surveillance ordinance that would capture all types of technology and all types of data that come from those devices, not just the streetlights.
And finally, we had an update from Dorian Hargrove at NBC7 San Diego, our partners. And he found that it wasn't just rapes and murders and such. The police have been accessing these cameras for all kinds of things.
Yeah, so it also included vandalism. It included illegal dumping. There was a evading arrest case in there as well, which is significant to me because when the police department was called in front of the Public Safety Committee in would have been June of last year after our story ran and other stories ran, the police department said, look, we're very selective about how we use these devices, and we've narrowed it down only to the most serious of crimes. But, you find vandalism in there now. And I asked the police department about it, actually, and they told me that those were serious crimes, and to suggest otherwise is not true.
Yeah, and they always make the point like, well, what do you, murders, we've solved rapes, we've dealt with this. And you're like, well, yeah, there's always going to be this balance, though. And you're always going to say like, well, let's just put a camera on everybody's face, right? Like, and boy, we could solve a lot of problems with that. And then there's always got to be a balance of like, well, yeah, but what about oversight? What if somebody abuses that? What if a police officer wants to follow somebody home? What if, there's all kinds, we have to have rules and checks and oversight in place. This is a democracy.
Yeah, look, nobody's against catching murderers and nobody's against solving crimes. The larger issue is, do we understand the capabilities of the technology in front of us? How is it growing? How is it changing?
How is it stored? How is it protected?
Exactly.
How is it shared?
Who has access to it?
Yeah.
Which is not, at this point, an abstract concern. We have a number of specific types of information or technology that at this point has introduced conflict between local law enforcement and federal immigration enforcement, where once there's a third party that has access to a particular type of information, that typically means that ICE or the Department of Homeland Security might have access to that information, running the city into conflict with its own professed position on whether it cooperates with immigration enforcement.
And it could be other, types of agencies as well. I mean, didn't your reporting show that other police departments outside of San Diego could access this? And so presumably, say California outlaws the death penalty, but a state that has the death penalty says this crime was, it's just like, it's open to so many possibilities.
Well, Jesse Marx, great reporting, and thank you for following that issue.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Voice of San Diego podcast. It is the most popular public affairs podcast recorded in downtown San Diego. It's recorded, in fact, in the Voice of San Diego podcast studio, which is sponsored by the Bob Nelson Charitable Fund. Thank you, Bob Nelson Charitable Fund. If you love the podcast, be sure to check out the Facebook group. Just search for Voice of San Diego podcast on Facebook. And we put in some commentary and discussion there. Be sure to check out our newsletters too. Andy and I do the politics report every week. Sara wraps up the entire week with her Sunday newsletter. That's called What We Learned This Week. Get those at voiceofsandiego.org/newsletters. I'm Scott Lewis, CEO and editor-in-chief. Andrew Keatts is assistant editor. Sara Libby is managing editor. And DJ Adriana Heldies was on the board today. This show is produced by Nate John, Megan Wood, and DJ Chica. And thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next week.